3 Ukrainian naval drone operators, 1 Russian warship, a shadow tanker worth more to Moscow's war economy than any tank column rolling through Donbass, and a window that would stay open for exactly 47 minutes before the Black Sea closed it forever. This is what happened when Ukraine's maritime strike teams found the gap in Russia's most protected convoy corridor. The water was flat, unusually flat for the northwestern approaches to the Kerch Strait. That kind of calm, the kind that makes the Black Sea look like poured concrete, is both a gift and a threat for naval drone operators. A gift because your targeting solutions hold steady. A threat because your low-profile composite hulls, normally hidden in wave chop and sea spray, become easier to spot against that mirror surface. The Ukrainian operators knew this. They planned for it. They launched anyway, because the target on their screens was worth the risk. I'm your host at ConflictEast, where we analyze the battles that change wars. What we're breaking down today isn't just a single strike. It's the anatomy of how Ukraine, a country with no surface fleet, no aircraft carrier, no destroyer force, has methodically dismantled Russia's Black Sea naval presence using weapons that cost a fraction of a percent of what they destroy. Today's operation is one of the most tactically sophisticated naval drone strikes of the entire conflict. And it happened in waters Russia thought it controlled completely. To understand why this particular strike mattered, you need to understand what Russia has been doing in the Black Sea for the past several months. After losing the Moskva, after losing the Olenigorsky Gornyak, after watching its Kilo-class submarines scramble from Sevastopol, never to return in any meaningful formation, Russia adapted. It didn't abandon the sea. It couldn't afford to. The Black Sea is Moscow's economic lifeline for war material resupply, fuel transit, and the shadow fleet operations that keep sanctioned oil flowing to markets that look the other way. What Russia built instead was a layered protection system. Naval escort vessels, older corvettes and patrol boats from the Caspian and Black Sea flotillas, began running alongside the tankers and cargo ships that kept the war economy breathing. Not fighting ships in the traditional sense, guardian ships, early warning platforms. Vessels whose job was to detect, report, and if necessary, absorb the first wave of any Ukrainian maritime strike so that the more valuable cargo behind them had time to react and scatter. The Pavlodar-class patrol boat assigned to this convoy run was one such guardian, roughly 500 tons displacement. Armed with a 30mm autocannon, surface search radar, and a close-in weapons system retrofitted from older surface-to-air hardware. Not a warship built to fight a fleet engagement, a warship built to see threats coming and buy time. The Russian naval establishment considered this an acceptable solution. The Ukrainians considered it a vulnerability they could exploit, because a guardian ship can only guard what it can see. The shadow tanker this escort was protecting operated under a Togolese flag of convenience, its automatic identification system transmitter cycling through 3 different vessel identities depending on which maritime tracking service was watching at any given moment. OSINT analysts working with Ukrainian naval intelligence had been tracking this vessel across multiple voyages. Satellite imagery confirmed its loading patterns at a Russian port on the eastern Black Sea coast. Infrared signatures from commercial satellites showed thermal anomalies consistent with crude oil cargo at temperatures that matched recent loading, not weeks-old transit. The ship was part of a network that had moved an estimated 340,000 tons of sanctioned Russian petroleum products through Black Sea corridors in a single operational quarter. Each successful run generated revenue that fed directly into Russia's defense procurement cycle. This was not incidental commerce. This was a financial artery. Ukrainian naval intelligence designated the operation not just as a strike against a warship, but as an interdiction mission against the economic infrastructure sustaining Russia's capacity to prosecute the war in Donbass. That framing mattered because it changed the risk calculus. Taking on a Russian naval escort in open water, within range of Russian aviation assets based in occupied Crimea, with no surface fleet of your own for backup, that's not a decision made lightly. But when the target is the entire shadow logistics chain the escort is protecting, the mathematics shift. The Kerch Strait approaches, where Russian naval presence remains heaviest despite the losses Kiev has inflicted, were the most dangerous corridor for Ukrainian maritime operations. Coastal defense batteries on the Crimean side, patrol boat deployments from Kerch itself, aviation cover from air bases Russia has heavily fortified. Ukrainian sea drones operating in this zone were at the absolute edge of their tactical envelope. Which weapon was deadlier in this kind of maritime interdiction? Sea drones, cruise missiles, or naval artillery? Comment A, B, or C below. The answer becomes clearer as this engagement unfolds. The strike package Ukrainian operators assembled for this mission drew on 18 months of maritime drone operations in the Black Sea. Early operations had relied on single or paired drones approaching on direct vectors, tactically simpler but predictable. Russian escort crews adapted to that threat model. They learned to watch for the characteristic radar signature of a Magura V5 or a Sea Baby approaching on a constant bearing, and they developed intercept procedures using autocannon fire at ranges beyond the drone's most dangerous close-in approach phase. Ukraine adapted faster. The new doctrine, visible in strike footage that Ukrainian military intelligence released after operational security review, involved what operators called a convergence package. Not drones approaching from one direction. A coordinated swarm launching from multiple dispersed positions, using different approach vectors calculated to arrive within a compressed time window. Close enough together that a single ship's crew couldn't engage all threats simultaneously, but spread far enough apart that losing one or two drones to defensive fire wouldn't compromise the overall strike geometry. For this operation, the Ukrainian strike cell deployed 7 Magura V5 maritime drones. The Magura V5 is a Ukrainian-designed unmanned surface vessel built from composite materials with a low radar cross-section. It rides low in the water, roughly 60 centimeters of freeboard at operating speed, which makes it difficult to acquire visually until dangerously close. At full speed, it reaches approximately 42 knots, fast enough to close the final engagement distance before most shipboard weapons can track and engage effectively. Each drone carries a warhead payload of approximately 320 kilograms of high explosive. Not enough to sink a frigate. More than enough to mission kill a patrol boat, shatter a radar array, destroy a bridge, or detonate ammunition stored on deck. 7 drones, arrayed across an arc of nearly 140 degrees, set to converge on a single point in the water at a calculated intercept time. The operators didn't just build a strike, they built a tactical problem that had no clean solution. Stay with me. What happens in the next 18 minutes of this engagement destroys not just a warship, but the entire framework Russia believed was protecting its most valuable Black Sea convoy. The pre-strike phase lasted longer than the strike itself. Ukrainian intelligence assets, a combination of commercial satellite passes, signals intelligence intercepts, and maritime tracking data fed through analytical frameworks developed with partner nation support, had been building a picture of this convoy's movement pattern for weeks. The shadow tanker had a preferred routing corridor. Not exactly predictable, but not random either. Like all ships operating under commercial logic, even ships serving military purposes, it followed paths of least resistance. Water depths that suited its draft, currents that reduced fuel consumption, distances from known Ukrainian strike assets that its Russian naval escort commanders considered acceptable. Ukrainian analysts identified 3 probable transit windows based on observed patterns, tidal conditions, and the tanker's recent port departure schedule. They were watching all 3. When the satellite pass confirming the tanker's position came through, the strike cell was already at standby. The Russian escort commander, a mid-grade naval officer operating under doctrine that emphasized horizon scanning and radar coverage rather than the all-aspect threat awareness that maritime drone warfare demands, ran what his training described as a standard patrol pattern. His ship swept forward of the tanker on a modified zigzag designed to clear the approach corridor. His radar operators were good. They were watching their screens. They picked up what appeared to be surface contacts at extended range. The problem was attribution. The Black Sea is full of surface contacts, fishing vessels, small cargo boats, debris. The radar returns from low-profile composite drones at 14 kilometers look almost identical to certain sea state echoes and small vessel signatures. The Russian escort crew marked the contacts. They watched them. They queried them against their identification systems. And while they were doing that, the contacts were closing at 40 knots. Intercept time, 11 minutes. Subscribe to ConflictEast if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what happened next is a masterclass in exactly that. How many drones did Ukraine successfully guide to target in the engagement's critical final phase? A 3B5C6? The answer comes at the end, and it matters for understanding the strike's outcome. The Russian captain made his decision at approximately 8 kilometers. He'd identified at least 3 of the 7 Ukrainian drones on radar. His crew began tracking. The 30mm autocannon started slewing toward the nearest contact. Fire control radar locked. The first burst went out. 2 of the drones adjusted course. Not dramatically. The Ukrainian operators, monitoring feeds from cameras mounted in the drone bows, made small heading corrections that changed the fire control solution without breaking the overall convergence geometry. The Russian gunners had to reacquire. That took time. Not much time. Enough time. Because they were tracking 3 drones. The other 4 were still out there. The autocannon destroyed 1 drone at 4,200 meters. A clean intercept. A burst of 30mm rounds stitching across the waterline, the explosion vivid in the gray morning light. The Russian crew registered the kill. Someone on the bridge may have felt a moment of relief. an emotion that lasted approximately 8 seconds. Because the remaining 6 drones were now inside 4 kilometers and the geometry had fractured into something no single weapon station could solve. The Russian escort's radar was trying to track 6 surface contacts moving at 40 knots from vectors spanning more than 90 degrees of arc. The 30mm cannon physically cannot traverse fast enough to engage threats arriving from multiple bearings in the same time window. The captain ordered emergency evasive maneuver, hard turn to port, attempting to present his ship's bow, the narrowest cross-section, to the most threatening approach bearing. That was the right instinct. It would have worked against 1 drone. 2 at most. Against 6, it was a choice about which parts of the ship would absorb what. The first impact came on the starboard quarter, just after the bridge structure. A Magura V5 warhead detonating against a ship's hull at the waterline generates a shockwave that travels through the steel in microseconds, shattering welds, buckling frames, creating catastrophic flooding pressure that no damage control team can address while the ship is still maneuvering at speed. The Russian escort rocked violently. Power fluctuations hit the radar systems immediately. The second impact came 16 seconds later, amidships on the port side. 2 near-simultaneous hits from opposite bearings. Physics is unforgiving. The structural forces propagated through the hull in competing directions, and steel that might have absorbed 1 catastrophic event fractured under the compound stress. The third impact, 3 seconds after the second, struck the forward section near the ammunition storage for the main gun system. The explosion that followed was not the warhead detonating. It was the escort's own ammunition cooking off. Here is where the tactical picture becomes something more than just a warship destroyed. When the escort's ammunition magazine detonated, the visible fireball rose high enough to be captured by both the drone cameras and by commercial imaging satellites on descending orbital tracks over the western Black Sea at that moment. OSINT analysts had that imagery within hours. The blast radius, estimated from post-event analysis, was significant enough to shatter the surface radar and communications arrays completely. More importantly, it was visible from the Shadow tanker's bridge at a distance of approximately 8 kilometers. The tanker's captain, operating under standing Russian naval protocol for convoy operations, had one instruction for exactly this scenario. If escort vessel incapacitated or destroyed, execute emergency course change to designated safe haven and transmit distress on secure frequency. He executed the emergency course change. And in doing so, he sailed directly into the secondary coverage zone that Ukrainian operators had anticipated he might reach. This is the layer of planning that separates what Ukraine has built in the Black Sea from anything Russia's naval establishment prepared for. The Magura V5 drones deployed against the escort were the visible strike. But Ukrainian naval intelligence had also positioned 2 additional drones, lighter configured versions carrying smaller payloads, at pre-calculated holding positions in the water, not attack drones in the first wave, Shepherd drones, assets whose purpose was not to destroy but to influence, to be visible to the tanker captain's radar at exactly the moment he was making his emergency routing decision, herding him toward a position rather than striking him immediately. The tanker turned west, toward what its captain's radar showed as slightly clearer water, toward what Ukrainian analysts had mapped as the most probable emergency routing corridor based on their study of this vessel's previous evasion responses, toward the 2 drones that had been waiting there. Was this the right tactical decision by Ukraine's strike planners? To allocate assets to the secondary herding function rather than concentrating everything on the primary escort target? Think about it as this engagement develops. There's a stronger argument for that choice than might first appear. The Shadow tanker was never the primary destruction target. A Magura V5 warhead against a ship of that displacement, roughly 8,000 deadweight tons, would damage it, might set it on fire, might cause it to take on water. But tankers are compartmentalized by design, and an unladen or partially laden tanker has enough redundant buoyancy that it might survive 1 or even 2 hits and make port for repairs. The economics of the Shadow fleet are such that Russia can absorb the loss of cargo, even the loss of the vessel itself, and simply replace it within weeks through the networks of shell companies and compliant flag registries that keep the Shadow fleet operational. What Russia cannot easily replace is the insurance of impunity. The psychological certainty that the Shadow fleet's routes are protected, that the convoy corridors are safe, that the escort vessels are a credible deterrent. When the tanker captain's emergency routing brought him into radar detection range of the 2 waiting Ukrainian drones, and he began transmitting distress signals. Not because the drones struck him, but because they were there, visible, positioned in his escape corridor, showing that Ukraine knew exactly where he would try to run. The message transmitted to every other captain in that Shadow fleet. Network was not 1 ship lost. It was, they can find us anywhere. If you believe tactics win wars, type ConflictEast in the comments. The tanker reversed course again, turned northeast, increased speed to maximum. Its radar showed the drones tracking but not closing rapidly. The Ukrainian operators maintained contact, maintained presence, but held the drones at distance. A calculated decision. Strike the tanker now and you sink one ship. Maintain visible pursuit and demonstrate that Ukraine knows where the ship will run, and you potentially disrupt dozens of future transits. The immediate kinetic effect was secondary to the persistent denial of safe transit message. The tanker eventually reached a holding position east of the Kerch approaches, where Russian naval and Coast Guard assets could provide coverage, and anchored there for what satellite tracking later showed was an extended period. It did not complete its intended transit. The cargo it was carrying, fuel products destined for distribution points supporting Russian logistics operations in occupied territory, did not arrive on schedule. One strike mission, 7 drones, 1 warship destroyed, 1 cargo run disrupted, and a ripple effect through the Shadow Fleet's operational confidence that Ukrainian naval intelligence assessed as significantly impacting scheduling across the network. The after-action picture that emerged through OSINT analysis, Ukrainian General Staff reporting, and satellite imagery review told a more complete story than the initial strike footage. The Russian escort vessel was assessed as a total loss. Combat footage verified the ammunition detonation, the secondary fire, and the vessel's subsequent loss of maneuvering capacity. Ukrainian sources estimated the strike destroyed a ship valued at approximately $38 million in replacement cost at current Russian naval procurement rates, accounting for the disruption to their supply chains caused by Western sanctions on shipbuilding components. More significant than the monetary value was what was lost with it: the radar data, the communications logs, the operational protocols that Russian Naval Command would have to assume were potentially compromised, and the tactical blueprint of exactly how Russia had been routing these convoy operations. Ukraine doesn't just destroy ships. It harvests operational intelligence from the patterns of what it destroys and doesn't destroy, building an ever more precise picture of how Russia's shadow maritime network functions. Intercepted radio communications from the period following the strike, shared in summary form through Ukrainian military intelligence channels, indicated that the loss generated significant command-level discussion about escort protocols. Russian naval leadership reportedly suspended convoy operations in that particular corridor for a period of days while conducting damage assessment and reviewing whether the escort configuration had been compromised. That operational pause, even brief, disrupted fuel transit schedules with downstream effects on logistical operations in occupied territories. The strike confirmed something else that ConflictEast has analyzed across multiple operations. Ukraine's maritime drone operators have developed an intuitive understanding of how Russian naval commanders think, built from accumulated operational experience across dozens of engagements. They know the protocols. They know the reflexes. They know that when a Russian escort ship starts taking fire, its first instinct is to present its bow. They know that when a tanker captain activates emergency procedures, the routing options he'll choose correlate strongly with what his radar shows him is the path of least resistance. They know these things because they've tested them, because they've studied them, because Ukraine has built, from scratch, a naval strike capability that operates entirely on understanding rather than overwhelming force. What would NATO doctrine have prescribed for this type of operation? Comment your analysis, because the divergence between conventional naval doctrine and what Ukraine actually executed here reveals something important about how this war is rewriting the operational manuals. 4 hours after the strike, Russian state media ran a brief item acknowledging an incident in the Black Sea involving a vessel performing security functions. No admission of the escort's destruction. No acknowledgement of the shadow tanker's failed transit. The framing was minimal, attributed to unnamed naval officials, and paired with claims that Ukrainian drone operators had been repulsed, a formulation that the satellite imagery and drone footage flatly contradicted. Ukrainian military sources, by contrast, released a detailed after-action statement within 24 hours, accompanied by edited drone camera footage showing the approach phase, the engagement, and the post-strike assessment. The footage showed what the numbers confirmed: 3 impacts on the escort vessel, 2 on critical structural and systems areas, 1 on the forward ammunition section, and the subsequent catastrophic explosion that guaranteed the ship would never return to service. The transparency was deliberate. Ukraine's maritime drone operations serve a strategic communication purpose alongside their tactical effects. Every piece of documented footage released through official channels reaches the community of maritime operators, shipping company risk analysts, and flag state authorities who collectively make the decisions that sustain or constrain the Shadow Fleet's operations. The message embedded in every released strike video is directed not just at Russia's naval command, but at every captain, every shipping company director, every insurance underwriter considering whether the risk of participating in Russia's shadow fleet operations is worth the premium. When those actors see footage of a Russian naval escort vessel destroyed in waters Russia publicly guarantees are under its protection, waters where Russia has stationed surface vessels, deployed coastal defense systems, and maintained aviation coverage from Crimea, the credibility of Russia's protection guarantee collapses, not just for that corridor, for the entire Black Sea shadow fleet concept. This is Ukraine's strategic theory of maritime warfare. You don't need a navy to deny an adversary the sea. You need enough capability, enough consistency, and enough documented success that using the sea becomes economically and operationally irrational for your enemy. The Magura V5 program, designed, manufactured, and deployed by Ukraine with minimal external assistance, is one of the most innovative weapons development achievements of any country in this conflict. The drone costs approximately $500,000 per unit. The Russian escort vessel, it destroyed cost over 70 times that. The cargo transit it disrupted represented economic value in the tens of millions. The ripple effect on shadow fleet scheduling confidence generated disruptions worth multiples of that. By any cost-exchange ratio metric used in military planning, this operation was not just a tactical success, it was an economics lesson. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. The production of the Magura V5 and its successors draws on Ukrainian engineering capacity that predates the full-scale conflict. Maritime design expertise, composite manufacturing capability, precision electronics production that Ukrainian industry adapted from civilian and defense sectors as the war evolved. Partner nations provided components and technical knowledge. Ukraine provided the tactical doctrine, the operational experience, and the continuous feedback loop between operators in the field and engineers at the production level that allowed rapid iteration. Features that appeared in later production batches: improved electronic countermeasure resistance, modified propulsion for better performance in rough water, refined guidance system updates, came directly from combat lessons observed by operators and transmitted back to development teams within operational security constraints. This model of wartime innovation, tight loops between combat experience and design iteration, compressed from the years that conventional defense procurement requires to the weeks or months that wartime necessity demands, is one of the most significant military-industrial developments this conflict has produced. It has specific relevance for the maritime domain, where Ukraine started with almost no capability and built something that has strategically altered the Black Sea operational picture. Real tactics, real consequences. ConflictEast. The broader context of what Ukraine has achieved in the Black Sea extends well beyond individual strikes, impressive as those have been. When the full-scale conflict began, Russia's Black Sea fleet was a coherent operational force. It could conduct amphibious operations. It had cruise missile launch capacity from surface vessels. It had the logistical infrastructure in Sevastopol to sustain extended naval operations. Most Western defense analysts at the time considered it one of the stronger regional naval forces in the world. That assessment required rapid revision. The sinking of the Moskva, a guided missile cruiser, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, by Ukrainian Neptune anti-ship missiles in the early phase of the conflict, was the first indication that the Russian naval establishment had fundamentally miscalculated the threat environment. The Moskva's loss wasn't just the destruction of a warship, it was the destruction of a doctrine. Russian naval officers had operated under the assumption that their ships were protected by the threat of escalation, by the inherent difficulty of anti-ship missile operations for a country with limited organic naval capabilities, and by their own electronic warfare and countermeasure systems. All three assumptions proved incorrect. What followed was a systematic dismantling. Kilo-class submarines relocated from Sevastopol under threat. Amphibious landing ships struck in port. The infrastructure of the naval base itself targeted by Storm Shadow and SCALP, e.g. cruise missiles supplied by the United Kingdom and France. Precision strikes that damage dry dock facilities and fuel storage in ways that degrade long-term fleet maintenance capacity as well as current operations. The Kerch Bridge, the critical logistics artery connecting Russia's territory to occupied Crimea, struck repeatedly, its operational capacity degraded, and its psychological significance eroded with each strike. Against this background, the escort and shadow tanker operation represents the latest evolution in a strategic maritime campaign that Ukraine has sustained with remarkable consistency. The Black Sea Fleet that entered this conflict as a credible operational force has been reduced to a contested, defensive, risk-averse posture that struggles to project power or protect even its highest priority assets. Russia's naval leadership, which once planned offensive operations against Ukrainian coastal infrastructure, now spends its energy on survival planning. That transformation happened without Ukraine ever having a surface fleet of its own. Ever dealt with an intelligence or tactical puzzle where the solution that looks simple in retrospect was nearly impossible to see in the moment? Comment below. Because the targeting calculation Ukraine's naval drone operators solve in real time, accounting for weather, target routing, escort behavior, and drone performance simultaneously, is exactly that kind of problem. The operators who ran this mission, the three-person cell that Ukrainian military sources described as the primary control element for the strike package, would not be identified by name. Ukraine protects the identities of maritime drone operators with the same classification rigor applied to special operations personnel. But their professional profile, as described in broad terms by Ukrainian naval intelligence briefings, reflects something important about how this capability was built. These were not experienced naval officers retrained for drone operations. They were not combat veterans from conventional maritime forces, because Ukraine didn't have those to draw from in meaningful numbers. They were young. Mid-20s was the reported average age of Magura V5 strike cell operators during this period. They came from engineering backgrounds, from technology sectors, from the gaming and simulation communities that Ukraine's digital native generation grew up in. They understood targeting software and systems integration intuitively. They could hold three-dimensional tactical geometry in their heads. 7 drones, multiple vectors, convergence windows, target responses, secondary positioning, and make real-time adjustments to a dynamic situation that no training simulation had specifically replicated. They learned to do this through the most expensive and unforgiving training program imaginable. Operational deployment in contested waters against an enemy that adapted its countermeasures with each encounter. Will operations like this one force a fundamental restructuring of how Russia operates the Shadow Fleet, not just in the Black Sea, but in every route it uses to circumvent sanctions? Comment yes or no, because the parallels to other maritime pressure campaigns suggest the answer has implications far beyond Ukraine. The tactical lessons of this particular operation contain insights applicable beyond this conflict. Convergence geometry. Designing an attack from multiple vectors with compressed time-on-target windows is not a new concept in military thinking. What is new is applying it with low-cost unmanned systems that can be manufactured at scale, deployed from non-military platforms, and operated by small cells with minimal infrastructure requirements. The force multiplication implications of that combination extend well beyond maritime warfare. The escort vessel's vulnerability lay not in its defensive systems, which were adequate for the threat models it was designed against, but in the cognitive and mechanical limitations of its crew operating under time pressure against a multi-axis threat. 7 drones arriving from 140 degrees of arc compress the engagement timeline below what a small ship's crew can respond to effectively. That's not a failure of training or equipment. It's a physical limitation of how many weapon stations a vessel of that displacement can carry and how quickly human operators can process and engage multiple simultaneous threats. The implication for future escort doctrine is significant. Protecting high-value assets against drone swarms requires either significantly more capable point defense systems with higher rates of engagement and faster target tracking, or a fundamentally different convoy architecture that disperses assets so that neutralizing one escort element doesn't open the path to the primary target. Russia has begun attempting both adaptations. Neither has yet restored the deterrent effect that existed before Ukraine proved these operations were feasible. The Ukrainian operators recovered their surviving drones. 3 of the 7, those that had not expended their warheads or been intercepted, were guided back to recovery vessels operating in Ukrainian-controlled waters, and began the after-action review process before the day was over. Drone camera footage was downloaded, analyzed, and fed back to both the tactical level and the engineering teams responsible for ongoing system development. The specific behaviors of the Russian escort's radar system, its maneuver responses, its fire control sequencing, all of it became data. Data that Ukrainian naval intelligence integrated into the targeting models for subsequent operations. The Black Sea approaches to the Kerch Strait are quieter now than they were in the early months of this conflict. Not quiet in the sense of peace, quiet in the sense of absence. The absence of the regular Russian naval activity that once made those waters feel controlled. The Ghost Fleet operates there still, but with different routing, different timing, different posture. All of it reflecting the awareness that the predictability that once made those routes efficient is now exactly what makes them dangerous. The wreck of the escort vessel settled into the Black Sea mud at a depth that commercial salvage could theoretically reach, but that Russian naval recovery assets haven't prioritized. It rests there alongside the others. The Moskva, the landing ships, the patrol boats that discovered, one by one, that the Black Sea is no longer a Russian lake. Silent reminders that modern warfare punishes tactical mistakes without mercy. Now, the answer to this operation's tactical quiz. How many drones did Ukraine successfully guide to target in this strike's critical final phase? The answer is B5. Of 7 drones deployed, 1 was intercepted by the escort's 30 cannon at 4,200 meters. 1 was destroyed by defensive fire at closer range. 5 completed their attack runs. Of those 5, 3 struck the escort vessel directly, and 2 were the hurting elements that influenced the tanker's emergency routing. The 3 direct hits, including the one that triggered the ammunition magazine detonation, were sufficient to achieve total mission kill on the escort. The 2 hurting drones completed their function by maintaining visible pursuit long enough to compromise the tanker captain's confidence in his emergency routing options. 7 drones, 5 successful, 2 lost to defensive fire, 1 warship destroyed, 1 cargo transit disrupted. That ratio, losing 2 of 7 assets to achieve both primary and secondary objectives simultaneously, is exceptional performance by any measure of unmanned maritime strike operations. Was the decision to allocate 2 drones to the hurting function the right call? The argument for? It achieved a strategic communication effect beyond the immediate destruction that a pure strike approach couldn't have generated. The argument against? Those 2 drones, configured as attack assets rather than hurting assets, might have guaranteed deeper damage to the tanker itself. The operators chose the strategic over the kinetic. The outcome suggests they chose correctly. Could the Russian escort commander have prevented this? Given the assets at his disposal, genuinely, it's harder than it looks. A single ship with 1 autocannon cannot engage 6 simultaneous surface contacts from multiple bearings within the engagement timeline that 40-knot drones generate. He could have maneuvered differently. He could have begun defensive fire earlier. He could not have changed the fundamental physics of the problem. What would you have done differently, commanding that escort? And what would Ukraine's planners have done if Russia had deployed 2 escort vessels instead of 1? Subscribe to ConflictEast. Because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Kerch approaches are quiet now, but the currents run over the wreck of a warship that thought it was a guarantee. It wasn't a guarantee, it was a target. And 3 Ukrainian operators, young, technically fluent, sitting in front of screens somewhere in Ukraine's hinterland, turned it into a lesson that every navy on Earth is studying. Real tactics, real consequences. ConflictEast.